It is the 30th of November, 1649. Outside the banqueting hall in Whitehall, London, a tremendous crowd has gathered before a scaffold. The scene is almost otherworldly, and until very recently, would have been utterly inconceivable. The execution block is set so low that the accused must nearly lie down in order to place his head on the block. Charles I, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, is called to the scaffold in what some would later describe as the saddest sight England ever saw. Having lost consecutive civil wars, the King of England is tried for treason by the people themselves and is found guilty. He gives a final speech, and his famous last words are, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." The axe falls. The executioner silently holds up Charles' head to the spectators. He drops it into the crowd, and the people are immediately upon it, dipping their handkerchiefs in his blood and cutting off locks of his hair. And yet, as the people watch, bewitched and bewildered at the sight of their slain king, another equally significant war is about to begin. A war that would be fought not with cannons and blades, but with the English language itself. It is the 30th of November, 1649, and as King Charles I awaits his inevitable death, a manuscript begins its long and unpredictable journey into immortality. But before we press on, let us try to understand how exactly we got here. So what were the English Civil Wars? They took place between 1642 and 1651, continuing even after Charles's death. They were fought between King Charles I and his parliament. Some scholars estimate that up to 200,000 people have lost their lives, a staggering number especially at the time, with most of the casualties being non-combat deaths and civilians. The exact reasons for the outbreak of the war could be a little hard to explain in short form, but let's give it a try nonetheless. If we were to try and distill the reasons into three, here's what we might come up with. Politics. Charles believed in the divine right of kings, that monarchs were appointed by God, and that he could govern his kingdom by himself. However, Parliament had already developed a role in government, a role they were very reluctant to give up. Religion. Church of England was Protestant and deeply mistrustful in anything Catholic. That is not to say that every man and woman in England were Protestant, but that was exactly the problem. Many people, especially the Puritans, believed that King Charles I favored the Catholics, a concern that was further cemented by his marriage to a Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria of France. The economic factors also played a part, with arbitrary and heavy taxes levied by the king being a burden on many people. War eventually broke out, a war that Charles's supporters lost, leading to his trial. Not to mention that in 1629, Charles dismissed Parliament and did not recall it for 11 years, a period that became known as the personal rule. Some argue that until the very last moment, Charles I could have saved his life and kingdom if he had simply conceded enough to his opponents, who would have much preferred to keep him as king, albeit in a much more limited role, than commit regicide. Which takes us back to the day of the execution and the birth of the Eikon Basilike, a book that would change history itself. The Eikon Basilike was presented as the king's own autobiography and became an immediate and unparalleled sensation. Though the book had been published too late to aid the executed king, it was the first and incredibly effective salvo fired in a new type of English civil war, a war that would, in many ways, decide the fate of this newly founded republic. The iconic frontpiece contained in the first edition did much to set the mood. It presents the late king kneeling in prayer, a crown of thorns in his hands, and his eyes facing upwards towards the crown eternal, resonating deeply with his final words, an incorruptible crown. And in the stroke of a pen, Charles I, King of England, was dead, but Charles the Martyr was born. The manuscript presents Charles I as a near saint, a wise and pious man who had wanted nothing but the good of his people. Those who supported the king were deeply stirred, describing the book as a product of the king's evangelical pen, and as a most pious, most ravishing book. Some even went on to describe Charles himself as nearer the similitude of God than he is to either man or king. In other words, a king has died, but a saint has been born. The immediate and unprecedented popularity of Eikon Basilike was such that within a month and a half of the king's death, no less than 20 English editions were printed. It went on to be translated into many languages, such as Dutch, French, and Latin, experiencing a surge of popularity in Europe, which in turn served to rouse support for Charles II, who had gone into exile following his father's death. The enormous success of the book and its incredibly touching and stirring portrayal of the king was becoming an immense threat for the Puritans and independents. While the new rulers of England had, at certain points, attempted to quell the book's popularity by banning it, those attempts were either unsuccessful or unenforced. After a few futile attempts to counteract the influence of the King's Book, the Puritans realized something had to be done. The first real response from the late king's opponents came in the form of the Eikon Alethein, which devoted its attacks not to the content of the king's book, but to its alleged authorship. The author of the Eikon Alethein, themselves choosing to remain anonymous, claimed not to know exactly who had written the Eikon Basilike, but they were quite certain it was not King Charles I. However, no substantial evidence were presented, and so the attack fizzled without much of an impact. And so, the Puritans called for none other than John Milton, who, decades before writing Paradise Lost, had been appointed as an important member of the new revolutionary republic. His weapon in this war of influence would be called the iconoclastis, the breaker of the icon. In his book, Milton would delve into a chapter-by-chapter deconstruction of the Eikon Basilike, deciding not to focus on the book's authorship as the Eikon Alethein had, but instead focusing on the content of the book itself. The tone Milton used was deeply personal. It was as if he was interrogating the author himself, employing sarcasm, wit, and mockery. But even though many considered Milton's Iconoclastis a skillfully executed counterattack, it simply could not withstand the overwhelming popularity of the King's Book. And so it appeared that the Royalists, despite having lost the war, have scored a powerful victory when it came to the battle for England's heart. Milton himself would only narrowly escape execution many years later, in part for his role in supporting the short-lived Commonwealth. It was only in 1960 that the seemingly unconquerable Eikon Basilike seemed to have suffered a real significant blow, through a rather unexpected chain of events, no less, and the revelation of what came to be known as the Anglesey Memorandum. In 1686, the third Earl of Anglesey passed away, leaving behind his vast personal library, which his heirs have decided to sell. Mr. Millington, an auctioneer, was the man placed in charge. While reviewing the books, Millington came across the Earl's copy of Eikon Basilike. As he did, he noticed a handwritten note stating that Charles II, who by then was King of England following the Restoration, had told him that the Eikon Basilike was none of the said king's compiling, but made by Dr. Godin, Bishop of Exeter. While Millington himself tried to destroy the note, another man had seen it and managed to copy it in time, deciding to publish it only in the year 1690. Naturally, there was a great uproar. One of the things that further supported the Godin theory was a correspondence with Sir Edward Hyde in 1660, in which Godin complains that granting him the bishophood of Exeter was a lacking reward for the secret and great service he had performed for the crown. In the correspondence, Godin finally confesses that he had written the book in its entirety. Scholars who have closely examined the book have come to the same conclusion, uncovering clear similarities between the Eikon Basilike and Godin's writing, including similar metaphors, favorite phrases, and the use of uncommon words. But there are also many who can confirm that the Eikon Basilike was indeed written by Charles I, and many people have testified that they have seen him write it. One of Godin's servants, William Ellen, testified that he had seen his master copying the original manuscript. So perhaps he was simply a copyist? The truth is that no one exactly knows who has written the Eikon Basilike. Some believe it was a combination of the two. Perhaps the king had started it and Dr. Godin finished it. Perhaps the king wrote parts of it and then Godin had to rewrite them. Whether King Charles I had any role in the writing of the Eikon Basilica becomes almost irrelevant at this point, as the book had been an undisputable success in its lifetime, and in many ways probably contributed to the fact that a mere 11 years after Charles's execution, his son, Charles II, was restored to the throne. Perhaps this is another proof that the pen is truly sharper than the sword, and the hearts and minds of people sway in mysterious, sometimes unpredictable ways.